thank you.
Magic.
I wonder where I was.
It really is magic. We've been doing we've been doing things this past year that we've never done before, such as Zoom Shivas. Well, with a Zoom Shiva, there's a problem with that in that you're really not hands-on with the people, but people can come to from all over the world can join in a Shiva. I know that there are people who are attending services,
Yes.
in different countries.
Yeah. We've been doing it on Friday night.
Yeah. So how far afield have you gone?
Kind of close to home.
Close to home. Okay. I have 10:30. So good morning, everyone. Chapter 5, which was really all mostly about our character Victor. By the way, I see Bruce. I see Bruce Stern. Bruce sent me a very troubling. First of all, there's an article in today's New York Times front page article about anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And Bruce sent me a very troubling piece that was in the Los Angeles Jewish newspaper about a guy. Bruce, what was his name? I don't remember his name.
I can't recall either, Rabbi.
There are people who go around. They are people who are trying to cause trouble. Now, exactly what he was doing, I don't know, but he went around on the Portland State campus at PSU, collecting money for a Hamas organization that doesn't exist.
Right.
Now, I could understand people being sympathetic, but evidently he said, this is for the purpose of destroying Israel. It's for the purpose of, and as he went around the campus, I don't know how many, but people gave him money. So this was very a troubling report.
Rabbi?
It was an incomplete report. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt. I also sent it to Mark Blattner.
Mm-hmm.
And what's even more troubling is that Mark said that he thought he saw the same thing a couple years ago. So maybe this is the typical Palestinian strategy of showing past information and implying that it's currently happening.
And what do you want to do?
I don't know.
So in any event, one of the things that which we don't need to talk about right now, Elaine suggested, asked the question about whether these families parallel in many ways the Rothschilds in Europe. And I think there are probably similarities, but I think there are probably quite a lot of differences. So one of the possibilities, we could read one of the many texts about the Rothschilds. So we can talk about that. Bruce, I have not heard from Jonathan Kaufman. However, my wife said maybe you have to pay him, and that stands to reason if we want him to. You look quizzically, Bruce. So he didn't respond. I don't know if he would respond if I suggested, how much would you like to be paid in order to meet with the class? Or maybe he just missed the email or didn't think it was valuable to respond to. So I don't know. I will try again and see what happens. I think I'd like to do something different today than I've done in the past, and that is to go through the many characters that were in this chapter, and solicit from you thoughts about who these people are, what your impressions were. So let me go through the list. And then we can, there's first of all, Victor Sassoon, Eli Kaduri, and Silas Hardun. These three individuals. Then, of course, there is Victor's interactions or feelings about Gandhi, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao, the Japanese, the issue of Hong Kong. There were these relatively minor characters of Emily Hahn, Henry Luce, the description of an area of Shanghai called the Hongqiu, and the international settlement. Why don't we start with Silas Hardun, who's only mentioned in this chapter. I don't think we hear about him again. Anybody remember who Silas Hardun was? Anybody want to jump in? Silas Hardun. Well, Silas Hardun was also a Baghdadi who was trained in the Sassoon schools. He then works for Sassoon and on and off, and decides that he's dealing with real estate for the Sassoons, and I think decides, why am I making money for them? I'll make money for myself. He starts his own company, and he becomes fabulously wealthy buying real estate. Largely, it appears that he buys apartments. We're not talking about 2, 3, 5. I think it's probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of apartments. He becomes equally wealthy with the Sassoons in charging rent for these apartments. What's interesting is, and not mentioned in the book, I mean, it says in the book that what we're told in the book, in the chapter, is that after he died, his family sort of fought over the estate, and in fighting over the estate, Victor Sassoon starts buying up the holdings, Hardun's holdings, I guess, from the family. If you look on the internet about Silas Hardun, evidently he married a Euro-Asian woman, and when Silas Hardun died, they fought. His wife and Hardun's children fought over the estate. There was a long, protracted court case. She wins, then she dies, and the children fight among themselves. And that's sort of the end of the Harduns. You know, it's one of those stories that we hear often. You know, how rich do you have to be that people can't be satisfied? They probably wasted a huge amount of money fighting each other in the first case and in the second case. You know, you'd think that there was plenty of money for them to each somehow figure out how to divide it and be comfortable. That's the end of the Hardun story.
You know, Rabbi, it reminded me of the Trumps, because the Trumps made their money senior, in other words, Donald's father, by buying real estate in New York. In
Right.
their case, it was not high rent real estate, it was slum real estate, but it was the same idea of buying up property. That's how Trump Sr. made his money.
Yep.
Trump Jr., of course, inherited it plus.
Right. So
We're cut out.
So let's, how about Kaduri? Let's talk about, he's not mentioned a lot in this chapter, but what do we learn about Eli Kaduri? Anybody? Anybody want to give us a little piece on Eli? What does Eli Kaduri do? Little piece he's mentioned in this chapter. Any volunteers? Well,
All right, I'll say something, I guess.
good.
It just, he had to struggle more. I think he had to come up from more of nothing than the Sassoons. And so he seems to be informed throughout the whole process from a different place, because he didn't start off as rich. And so he needed to break off, and he needed to start, and he needed to prove something, and he needed to do it. And I think he had a bit more maybe understanding of blending in with the local culture, making friends with the local people. He just wasn't as snobby as the Sassoon family. And you see it all throughout their history, this lack of snobbiness.
But he does something very interesting in this chapter. I think, Barbara, I think you're right.
Jumping ahead.
No.
I've read the whole book, and so it's hard for me to remember what happened in just this chapter.
In this
I'll take a shot.
chapter,
He decides to move a lot of his operation to Hong Kong, and which is very fortunate, because eventually the Sassoon interests are pretty much eliminated by the communists. So the Kaduris march on at a different location, and Sassoon is heading for trouble.
Yeah, he doesn't say directly in the book what the issue was, but I have this sense that he's already concerned about the nationalists and the communists, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao, who are already fighting, and he's less comfortable with his protection in Shanghai than he is in Hong Kong. So he moves things to Hong Kong. Now remember, Hong Kong becomes British as a result of the Second Opium War, which is a whole different relationship than the British have to Shanghai. And interesting, he builds these hotels. Most particular, which you mentioned last week, is the Peninsula. The Peninsula still today is the fanciest hotel in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has a lot of hotels and a lot of fancy hotels. And there are several other cities with peninsulas. So the Kaduris are still around. And then he builds something called, he has a couple of partners, and there's land, it appears, way out on, not on Hong Kong, but on the other, and on Kowloon. It sounds like it's empty land, and he buys it, and he builds there what's called Kaduri Hill. If you Google Kaduri Hill, you'll still see that today it is still a very fancy area, very expensive area of estates in Hong Kong. Still called Kaduri Hill. I think the main street is named after Kaduri. So they did very, very well. And sounds like in chapter 5, that's the end of the Kaduri story in Shanghai. It's not. We will hear more about the Kaduris later on. I agree with Barbara. There's something nicer about the Kaduris than the way the Sassoons function.
But at that time, was not China itself falling apart? Was Sisi the Empress, and they were having all kinds of internal issues, which made the rise of Sun Yat-sen happen? And
Yep.
he was a friend of Dr. Sun Yat-sen.
I don't remember that, but that's probably the case. And he sees turmoil. He
Well,
sees
it
that
was,
the
it was terrible turmoil.
but the Sassoons, ensconced in this international settlement, and think that they're protected by the British, the French, and the Americans, are oblivious to all this that's going on. Gandhi is mentioned in chapter 5. What's Gandhi's role? How does Gandhi?
I forget.
Gandhi himself is a nationalist. He's determined, understandably, he's determined to throw the British out. And the Sassoons are British loyalists, and they're concerned about Gandhi. And it seems that it's because of Gandhi that Victor Sassoon, who's located in India, moves his operation, much of his operation, to Shanghai. So what happens in India
Okay.
will eventually happen in China as well. That he tells the British that they should woo Gandhi and join forces to fight the communists in India. And the British poo-poo that idea and say, nah, he's just this bum in rags. The British had the British aligned themselves with Gandhi against the communists, that might have been a different outcome. But in fact, I guess the communists were not as powerful or as strong as the communists become in China.
But the whole British Empire was falling apart.
Right, the whole British Empire. Carol says the whole British Empire was falling apart, but no one could necessarily foresee that. Chiang Kai-shek.
Yes.
Who wants to tell? Anybody want to share something about who this guy was and what his influence was?
Let's talk about him and talk about his wife.
You want to talk about his wife? Okay.
Well,
What do you want to tell us about his wife?
Mainly because she was very powerful, or became very powerful.
Wasn't she the sister of
Yeah.
Sun Yat-sen's? Of Sun Yat-sen was his.
There were there were three sisters. Yeah.
Right, and it's very interesting that
American educated.
it's important. Yes, she was American educated. Carol is sitting here next to me. Why don't
I'm here, but I'm having breakfast.
So I think largely Chiang Kai-shek was a crook, was a goon, but that was not how it was played up in the United States.
Oh no!
Anybody
No.
remember why?
No.
Why? Who was one of the people mentioned in our chapter that gave Chiang Kai-shek legitimacy in the United States?
Well, it must be Franklin Roosevelt.
Well,
Newspaper guy.
actually, in our text, it's mentioned Henry Luce. Henry Luce, who was a publisher of Time
Time.
magazine,
Time magazine.
Right.
and wrote glowing articles. Henry Luce evidently was the son of a minister. Jonathan Kaufman tells us, and he thought Chiang Kai-shek was the future of China.
Right. Yes.
And wrote glowingly about Chiang Kai-shek. When Chiang Kai-shek was, he did really sort of, he would befriend certain people, like he befriended Victor. And then when he didn't, when Victor was in the way, Why? First of all, why did he befriend Victor? Anybody have any suggestion? Why did he befriend Victor?
I would always guess it's because of the money.
Well, that's right. He needed money in order for his and how did he? First of all, he went ahead and he taxed his Chinese business people through the roof, but did not tax these foreigners that way. Instead, what he did was he offered them bonds
You're worthless.
at 12 and 14%. And Victor bought these bonds. Because for 12 and 14%, we've been through that time of 12 and 14% here, but he couldn't earn that kind. He didn't earn that kind of money on his. And what happened? What happened with those bonds?
You couldn't collect.
They were worthless.
Yeah, they ended up being. He lost a fortune on them when Chiang Kai-shek took over the banks. Chiang Kai-shek took over the banks, and there's a whole issue of the U.S. going off the gold standard. And when the U.S. went off the gold standard, it was 1932, something like that.
Yeah.
U.S. went off the gold standard. All of a sudden, silver becomes a very precious commodity. And now Chiang Kai-shek, through the banks, makes everybody turn in their silver. He's desperate for money, and he also can't pay off those bonds at 12 and 14%. So while Chiang Kai-shek is the bulwark against Mao, he's I don't get a good feeling about Chiang Kai-shek at all. Any other thoughts about who this guy was?
Yeah, but at the time, he was a hero to the United States.
Yep.
Definitely.
Right. And why?
Because he was the bulwark, as you say, to the communists.
He was fighting. Right. We too were frightened of these communists. Priscilla, did you want to add something? Can't hear
I
you.
had a question.
Oh yeah.
He made everyone turn in their silver. Okay, how does he make everyone turn in the silver? Is this a door-to-door, give me your silver? Or is this just expecting the people to be loyal to him and handing over their silver?
I'm not sure they had the silver sitting in their living rooms. It probably was being held in some sort of where it could be I don't know, but I'm guessing where it could be.
So we're not talking about a physical piece of silver to hand over as much as
You may be.
In the early 80s, where if you look at US currency, at one time it said silver certificate. Now it says Federal Reserve note.
Right.
But what you do is make it illegal to own and hold silver. And it becomes a crime to hold it. So to escape the authorities, you should turn it in.
And you can't transfer it from.
So you can't use it and you can't save it or bank it. Okay, just want a little bit of clarity there. Thank you.
Good question. So I'm talking about America backed Chiang Kai-shek. Really, I think it appears to the end.
Yes.
Yep.
Did we know he was a criminal?
I'm sure we did.
Oh,
I don't think we cared. I mean, I think defeating communism, whether it be in China or it be in Russia, See, we didn't care who our allies were. I mean, that was, I think, very important.
People remember there was a female character in this chapter named Emily Hahn.
Yeah.
So what do we know about Emily Hahn?
That's his mistress.
One of
Who
many,
was-
but yeah.
Yes. Incidentally, he does remind me a bit of Trump. Lots of women into lots of different businesses, lots of adulation. Anyway, I digress. Emily Hahn was shared between Victor Sassoon and a Chinese person whose name I don't remember. Apparently that was okay for a while. Later on, to jump way ahead, he and Emily Hahn retire into the Bahamas together, but that's farther down the line. That's her role. She's also a reporter and apparently a very good one.
Yeah, she's evidently a world traveler. She's been to Africa. She's been to and writes. She writes for the New Yorker, I think. And through her relationship, not with him, but with this Chinese fellow, she warns Victor that the communists are a danger and he should watch out for the communists. And in the same way that the British poo-pooed Victor about Gandhi, he poo-poos her and says, we're well protected here. So she plays an interesting role as a reporter who's supposed to come to Shanghai just for a few days, and she stays, it appears, for quite some time. So Emily Hahn.
She comes with a sister.
She comes with a sister, that's right. But she's evidently, among other things, she's also a beauty. So all these women flock around Victor, which is, he's a very charismatic guy, but he's also what the old world was cripple. Today we would say handicapped. Right? He was, he had been, in World War I, he had been injured in a plane crash that injured his legs and his hip, so that he walked around from World War I on crutches, but nevertheless he still had was a ladies' man. So let me see. I made my list.
I had a question.
Yeah.
It said in there that he didn't marry till he was very old and married his nurse.
Yep.
Was there, I mean, was he of right mind at that point, that all of a sudden he gets married to his nurse and she gets the money?
Yeah, I don't know if she got the money. By the way, very old, I think, was in the mid-60s.
Oh.
Youngster.
Middle-aged.
Most of this nurse was Emily Hahn.
Thank you.
It was?
No.
No,
There
I think
was a young woman who took care of him before he moved to the Bahamas. Then he took her to the Bahamas with him to take care of him when he moved to the Bahamas. And then they got married after they'd been in the Bahamas together for a while. He had an affair with Emily Hahn for a while that was going on, but then he married the nurse, and that was the end of that.
Right. It gets confusing. There are a lot of characters here. So now we get to the central characters, Victor. Who wants to describe what kind of impressions did you get when you read about Victor?
I thought he was very charismatic.
Charismatic.
But a little bombastic, in addition, he was full of himself, basically, and very confident and full of himself and successful. And because of that confidence, I think he built a huge, empire before it came crashing down.
Remember, he as a younger man, he had been an athlete. He was an athlete, and he was unlike many other rich people in London. He was really a student. He graduated with honors in. He had studied history. So how did he get to? I used the word. I thought of the word on some level. I think they describe him as somewhat of a dandy. That's not a word that comes up in the text, but I don't. People feel that that's an appropriate description. Yeah.
Yeah, he's somebody I'd like to have a party with. I would like to have been at one of his parties. The way he described the parties and what they were doing and the people that were there and glamorous and the food flowing and the this and that. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it have been fun to be at one of those parties? That was the feeling I had.
I think there's some, and not only he was unbelievably competitive. Right? You're going to build a hotel. I'm going to build a bigger hotel. And I'm going to destroy your hotel. I'm going to make it so that you have a fancy hotel. Mine's going to be so fancy that nobody's going to want to go to your hotel anymore. At the end, well, I don't remember the Kadori Hotel. I don't remember what the name of it was, but in the end, he buys it and demolishes it. So there's something. He becomes jealous of Hardun, and this nobody Hardun who becomes rich, and he takes great pleasure in somehow after Hardun dies, taking over all the real estate that Hardun. There was a sense of, why didn't I buy all that real estate? Why did I let this nothing who came from not from India, from Baghdad. I'm responsible for his becoming rich. Damn it.
It's not clear to me what language is he speaking, or are they speaking?
Chinese.
Now, is it Chinese?
No.
I don't think so.
It's not Chinese, no.
I think English.
English, probably.
And
English from India? He doesn't say actually what language.
Later on, it talked about the languages, and I think it was English. In later chapters, because he was Britain, he lived in London, he lived in India, all influenced by English speaking. And most of the business in Shanghai, they said, was conducted in English. So.
Yep.
because earlier on, it talks about their speaking Hebrew, to his fellow Jews, but it doesn't come up again. And I just wondered what language it was.
I think one of the places he says they actually communicate in Judeo-Arabic.
That was a long time ago.
Early on. Maybe that's before. Now, Victor, do you remember? Victor is not in direct line. Victor is Victor is David's grandson, but remember the family divided into two. Elias or Eli. Eli is unhappy with his cousins who are in London having a good time, and he starts his own company. And evidently it's, and the fellow who's running the company is Reginald. Reginald is an incompetent, and he spends his time at the racetrack. So just turn it off. Just turn it off. Turn it off. Here. So Jacob, who is Elias, if I have this right, who is Eli's son, invites his cousin Victor to come to China. Victor, who's been living in London and has political aspirations, runs for office, and while it's close, he loses. So he comes to China. He comes to India, and also to China, and he likes it. So he's really Eli's nephew rather than his son, and he takes over this other part of the company.
I had a question about that.
Yep.
What, I mean, they mentioned his father just kind of in passing. Victor's father, was he not involved in any of the businesses?
There's a sense, I think, what I got at the beginning of the chapter was these guys are having a grand time in London. They're rich, and nobody's really interested in the business. So who's going to take over the business? It's almost like the Hebrew word is hefker. It's almost like here you have this going concern, and they're having a ball in London, currying favor with the royalty, and somehow Victor, maybe because he was handicapped, that it was somehow his thing, but he clearly was very talented. He worked with the American Air Force on behalf of the British to speed up plane production. So he's a very talented guy. Both socially, he's very talented in making relationships, and business. He's very. But somehow the rest of the family is they like the company making money, but they're not interested in going off, way off to this foreign place and working hard. They've made their money in opium. Opium is now illegal. They can't. So somebody has to turn this company around. Somebody has to turn this company into making money other places. One of the things he does is during the Depression, he does an awful lot of. He's making money during the Depression, moving money around from country to country, and he's got these banks, and they're fluctuating exchange rates, and so he's playing with that, and he gets influence because he's appointed to the Colonial National Legislative Assembly as a representative of the textile industry, and he's got a conscience, we think, because he part of that legislative assembly. He advocated for a limited work week to 60 hours, 60-hour work week. And he raised the minimum age to 12.
Now, is this in England?
No, this is in Shanghai.
This is still in China.
This is in Shanghai, right? He he watches what's going on. Let me see, what else do I have here? The Chinese government, which was weak, gave these foreigners free rein. It was almost like there was no government. They could do
It
whatever they
wasn't.
want.
It wasn't.
So he created Sassoon House. Remember, it was 9 stories, was the biggest building in Shanghai. It was grander than the Kadoories Majestic Hotel. He created the Cathay Hotel and this rivaled the best hotels and shops in the world. You had ships that went around with, and they stopped in Shanghai, and they marveled at what was there. He brought in a global management team. He himself moved into the 9th floor. It had indoor plumbing, the trendiest fancy women. They played jazz. There was, plenty of alcohol. The wealthy Chinese came. The tourist boats. It was easy money and easy morals. And I marked a place on page 120. Those of you have your book right there. Page 120. Here it says, Vicky Baum, author of the novel Grand Hotel, which was later made into a movie starring Greta Garbo. Anybody seen that movie? Grand Hotel with Greta Garbo. Came to Shanghai and wrote a sequel based on cosmopolitan lives that intersected at the Cathay. Here's a quote: optimists, pessimists, Westerners, Easterners, men, women, Europeans, Americans, Orients, I don't know what an Orient is, courage and cowardice, idealism and greed, enmity and love, people of every sort and color and tendency, voices, noise, laughter, tea, whiskey, the full orchestra of every description of humanity. That was tea time on the roof garden. Charlie Chaplin and Paulette Goddard, his wife-to-be, holidayed in Shanghai in 1936 and stayed at the Cathay. The previous time they stayed at the Kadoories Astor House Hotel, farther down the Bund. In the Tower nightclub, Chaplin told Victor he was keen to make a film set in China about a white Russian countess reduced to making a living as a taxi driver. The movie that later became A Countess from Hong Kong. People familiar with this Charlie Chaplin film, A Countess from Hong Kong, which I guess he made. So, it was grand, it was big, it was to counter whatever he had themed parties. He was into horse racing. Not only was he into horse racing, he owned the best racehorses in the world.
So all this was going on while there was an upheaval or beginnings of an upheaval in Europe. It's just a counterculture.
Let me see, what year are we talking about? We're talking between the wars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Japanese started in the mid-30s, though.
Yeah.
Right. So he created this concept of businessman as celebrity. Funny idea.
Yeah. Guess who?
Yeah. There were accusations that, or guesses that he was bisexual. Remember Hoffman, right? Kaufman tells the story of his sitting with a couple, and he's putting his hand on the leg of the woman, and she takes his hand away, and he then takes his hand and puts it on the leg of the man.
Right.
I'm not sure that that's an indication of anything, but
Yeah.
Nowadays, you never know.
1935, I think I wrote down here. Kaufman writes about starvation and disease. Rich and poor, foreigners. You had, and he tells a story about a fellow, I think, who became a doorman, a Chinese fellow who becomes a doorman, who is inspired by the communists, and he becomes a spy for the communists. Here he is, the doorman at the famous hotel, and he's giving them all the information about who's coming and who's going, who's there, who's not there. So we haven't talked about the Japanese on my list. So yeah, I did have it on my list. So what's the role of the Japanese?
They were invading China.
The Japanese were somehow invading. They were not, by European standards, particularly strong, but they were stronger than the Chinese. Yes, they start invading, and they take over this area called Hongkou, which is north of the international settlement. We're going to read about Hongkou again, because Hongkou is where the Jews were settled. 16,000 Jews that came to Hong Kong in the late 30s were moved to Hongkou, to this poor area of Shanghai. But the Japanese knew that they were technologically behind, and they sent students to learn from the West. In 1895, the Japanese defeated a weak China, and in 1905, the Japanese defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War.
The reason I'm laughing, by the way, is that my father's father, Grandpa Benny, had a price on his head from the Tsar's government because he was a deserter from the Russian Navy. He didn't want to fight in the Russo-Japanese War.
And you know, what's the name of the city? There's a city all the way in the north of China. They actually have an ice show every year that's world famous. What's the name of the city?
Oh,
Harbin.
that's,
Harbin.
no,
Harbin.
In Harbin, yes.
no,
And we flew to Harbin because there was and you walk down the street. First of all, the buildings are all Western, and there are plaques on all the buildings, all with Jewish names on them. Who was we had several people. First of all, the ex-prime minister of Israel, who was in jail, he was born there. Help me out.
Olmert.
Olmert was born there in Harbin. There's a Jewish cemetery there. There are all kinds of things. I have this sense that Phil, your grandfather was not the only one. I have a hunch that there were a lot of Jews that, after they fought in that war, never went home.
Yeah.
That they stayed there in the north of China. It's cold, terribly cold.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
isn't Harbin right across the river from Khabarovsk, Russia, which is Portland's sister city?
Could be. I don't know how close, but yes,
Yeah,
Khabarovsk is all
I
the
think
way
so.
east as well.
Yeah.
But also secretary. We had a secretary of the Treasury. American Secretary of the Treasury, who was also born in Harbin, Jewish. I don't remember his name either.
We had a lot of Jewish secretaries of treasury.
This is one a while back. Let me see what else.
I might mention that Lawrence Tribe was born in Shanghai. He is, when he speaks on legal matters from Harvard, I stop everything and listen.
Yep. Even so, the last couple of times I've seen him, he looks old, unfortunately.
Well,
Still speaks well.
So do I.
So do I.
Right, he's not 35 anymore. So Japan invades Shanghai in 1932. But they avoid the international settlement. Why do they avoid? All these things coming together? You have the China, you have the communists, you have the nationalists, you have the Japanese, and for the most part, they stay away from the international settlement. Why?
because it would involve other countries.
They're afraid of the British and the Americans, I think.
Didn't
And
last, but-
if they can avoid this international settlement, that the Americans and the British and the French will let them fight, let them do whatever they want. But this international settlement is not just these foreign businessmen. I think there's at one point it says there are 1 million Chinese
Yeah.
that live in the international settlement. The relations with Chiang Kai-shek, with Victor, begin to sour. And he gets trapped. His real estate, which is worth $500 million, and he tries to move money, banks. He's refused Chiang Kai-shek to help against the Japanese invasion. He didn't believe that Japan would go to war. They were strong but not modern. The British and American soldiers would protect the international settlement. Victor is while Victor is in India, there are bombs that go off in the international settlement, and the Japanese in China were ruthless. There was murder, there was rape. And then all of a sudden, at the end of this chapter, we read that Victor is under Japanese suspicion. He's seen as an enemy, and everything looks disastrous. Now, what's interesting is this is just chapter 5. You would think at the end of chapter 5, the story is over. But it's not, it's clearly not over. Even so, chapter 6 begins with by telling us about the first Jews that arrive.
Germany.
From
Austria.
Europe. And they come, they are given visas. Actually, you don't need a visa. They come to Shanghai because Shanghai is, by international agreement, an open city. And while they're refused everywhere else, they go. Many of them go to Shanghai. How many of you watched the Federation program yesterday on racism and hatred? Priscilla. There were a couple of. I had my criticism of some of the things that were done, but Bob Hornstein gave a very, I thought, very interesting presentation on anti-Semitism from the left and anti-Semitism from the right. And I know it's recorded. So if you're interested, I urge you to hear that and to hear the last presentation by Eric Ward. Eric Ward is a very interesting local character. He's written several pieces. He has this theory that the key to racism, the center of racism, is anti-Semitism. And one of the things that he points to is, of course, this whole issue of replacement theory. People familiar with replacement theory? Remember when they marched in Charlottesville, right? These Nazis shouted, "The Jews will not replace us." There is this sense on the right. There's also anti-Semitism from the left, but from the right, the Jews are involved in an international conspiracy to change the character of America. That the immigrants, the brown and black immigrants, are all an aspect of this Jewish effort to replace whiteness in America. You'll remember that when the fellow killed 9 people in Pittsburgh, he went to the synagogue because he said the Jews were involved in immigration. So Hias becomes a brand new enemy. I just share all those things with you because they're very interesting, and Eric Ward talks about that a lot. So if you're interested in these 2 presentations, they were recorded, and I guess they're available on the Federation website. So next week, in Yirtzeh Hashem, chapters 6 and 7. Which will now get us into the Jewish the Jewish issue as Jews begin to arrive who are escaping Nazism. So we've been focused on Asia, and now we get a focus on European Jews fleeing. All right, everyone. We'll see you next week. Yep. Priscilla?
Okay. My question is, when they're talking about Charlie Chaplin and the discussion that Charlie Chaplin had about making a movie or whatever, do you think he spoke, or was he in silence then?
Oh, you mean silent movies? Is that what? Yeah.
It was a joke. Okay.
Yes.
Where you were on page 120, where it says Charlie Chaplin and
Victor?
Chaplin in the Tower Club. Chaplin told Victor he was keen to make a film set in China. So do you think that he did it in pantomime, or was he speaking right there?
He did it with subtitles.
Oh, that's probably it. And music in the background on the organ playing in the theater.
My ignorance, does Charlie Chaplin not speak in any of his movies? Never speaks?
No, I think you're right. It was all in pantomime.
Well, I think the one at the very end, he did a talkie,
He did.
Okay.
but I don't know what the name of it was.
Yeah.
It was, and I don't think it was a success, that one.
All right.
You should have kept quiet then.
Disappointed. Anyway, I will be missing next week's class, but I'll pick it up on recording. We're actually going to get away for a few days, and I'll be out of touch.
Enjoy. I mean, look at this gorgeous sunshine outside. Why are you going away?
This is wonderful. Hopefully, we're going to get a little bit of that down on the southern coast.
We're going to get a warm weekend. I understand.
Yeah, we are.
I hope so.
So
I hope
this
so.
is fascinating, and I would encourage any of you to try the Federation's website or WOVA, WHOAVA is the company that handled the logistics of the Hate Summit yesterday. There were some very, very fine breakout sessions. And the keynote speaker at the beginning, this Bill de la Cruz, was an excellent speaker. There were many topics that were covered between the opening and the closing sessions. And just take a look at the titles and see if you can plug in to hear them. It was very, very well done.
Okay,
Great.
we'll see everybody next week.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay,
Okay. Thank
thank
you all.
you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Rabbi.
I know.
Thank you.
On to the next one.
On to the next one.